Hour is very early, faint blue and pale pink, as we arrive on the almost empty air train and walk along the cement pathway toward the door of grandfather's building. I want to step off the path and take off my shoes and walk with my bare feet on the cool, sharp grass. But today is not a day to deviate from what is planned. My parents and Bram and I are all quiet, thinking. None of us have work or leisure hours. Today is for grandfather. Tomorrow, things go back to normal again, and we will move on, and he will be gone. It's expected. It's fair. I remind myself of this as we climb into the elevator to go to his apartment. You can push the button, I tell Bram, trying to joke with him. Bram and I used to fight over who got to push the buttons when we came to visit. Bram smiles and presses the 10. For the last time, I think to myself. After today, there will be no grandfather to visit. We will have no reason to come back. Most people don't know their grandparents this well. The kind of relationship I have with my other grandparents in the farmlands is much more common. We communicate via port every few months and visit every few years. Most grandchildren watch the final banquet on the port screens, too, one step removed from what's happening. I have never envied those other children. I've pitied them. Even today, I feel that way. How long do we have before the committee shows up? Bram asks my father. About half an hour, my father answers. Does everyone have their gifts? We nod. Each of us has brought something to give grandfather. I'm not sure what my parents chose for him, but I know Bram went to the arboretum to get a rock from a spot as near to the hill as possible. Bram catches me looking at him, and he opens his palm to show me the rock again. It is round and brown and still a bit dirty. It looks like an egg, and when he brought it back yesterday, he told me that he'd found it under a tree in a pile of soft green pine needles that looked like a nest. He's going to love it, I say to Bram. He'll love your gift, too. Bram closes his fist around the rock again. The doors slide open, and we step out into the hall. I've made grandfather a letter for my gift. I got up early this morning and spent time cutting and pasting and copying sentiments on the letter-making program on the port. Before I printed the letter, I found a poem from the decade in which he was born and included it as well. Not many people care about poetry after they finish school, but grandfather always has. He's read all of the 100 poems many times. One of the doors along the hall opens and an old woman peeks her head out. You're going to the banquet for Mr. Ray's, she asks, and she doesn't even wait for us to answer. It's private, isn't it? It is, my father says, stopping politely to speak with her, even though I know he's eager to see his father. He can't keep himself from glaring down the hall at grandfather's closed door. The woman grumbles a little. I wish it were public. I'd like to go so I can get ideas. Mine's in less than 2 months. You can bet it's going to be public. She laughs a little, a short, harsh sound, and then she asks, Can you come and tell me about it afterward? My mother comes to the rescue, as she and my father always do for each other. Perhaps, Mama says, smiling, and she takes my father's hand and turns her back on the woman. We hear a disappointed sigh, and then a click behind us as the woman closes her door. The nameplate on her door says Mrs. Nash, and I remember that Grandpa has talked about her before. Nosy, he said. Can't you wait for her own turn to come instead of talking about it on Grandfather's Day? Bram mutters, pushing open the door to Grandfather's residence. It already feels like a different place, more hushed, a little lonelier. I think it's because Grandfather is not sitting at the window anymore. Today, he rests in a bed in the living room as his body shuts down, right on time. Could you move me over to the window? Grandfather asks, after saying hello to all of us. Certainly. My father reaches for the edge of the bed and pulls it smoothly toward the morning light. Remember when you did this for me? When I had all those inoculations as a child? Grandfather smiles. That was a different house. And a different view, my father agrees. All I could see from that window was the neighbor's yard and an air train track if I looked high enough. But beyond that, there was sky, Grandfather says softly. You can almost always see the sky. And what's beyond that, I wonder? And after this? Bram and I exchange glances. Grandfather must be wandering a little today, which is to be expected. On the day the elderly turn 80, the decline always accelerates. Not everyone dies at exactly the same time, but it is always before midnight. I've invited my friends to come immediately after the committee visits, Grandfather says, and then after they leave, I'd like to spend some one-on-one time with each of you, starting with you, Abram. My father nods. Of course.
Abraham.
What do you think of all this? They know exactly when he's going to die.
I don't like it. I don't like it.
How do they know that?
The rule.
Because they probably give him something and kills him.
Maybe that's what the red
Maybe. Maybe that's what the red pill does.
Oh,
The committee
snap.
does not take long. They arrive, 3 men and 3 women in their long white lab coats, and they bring things with them too. The banquet clothes that grandfather will wear, equipment for tissue preservation, a microcard with the history of his life so he can watch it on the port. With the exception of maybe the microcard, I think grandfather will like our gifts better. After a few moments, grandfather reappears wearing his banquet clothes. They're basically plain clothes, simple pants and a shirt and socks, but they are made of fine quality material, and he has been able to select the color. I feel something catch in my throat when I see the color he has chosen for his clothing is a light green. We're so much alike. And I wonder if he realized when I was born that the days of our banquets would be so close together, since our birthdays are only a few days apart. We all sit politely, grandfather in his bed and the rest of us on chairs, while the committee completes their first part of the celebration. Mr. Reyes, we present you the microcard with images and records from your life, they say. It's been compiled by one of our best historians in your honor. Thank you, grandfather says, reaching out his hand. The box containing the microcard is like the silver one we receive when we are matched, except for the color, gold. The microcard inside has pictures of grandfather as a small boy, a teenager, a man. He hasn't seen some of these images in years, and I imagine that he is excited to view them today. The microcard also includes a summary of his life in words, read by one of the historians. Grandfather turns the golden box over in his hands, as I did with my silver box not long ago at the match banquet. His life cupped in his palms, as mine was. One of the women speaks next. She seems gentler than the others, but maybe that's because she's smaller and younger than the rest. Mr. Reyes, have you chosen the person to take possession of your microcard when today is over? My son, Abram, grandfather says. She holds out the device for the tissue collection, which, as a final courtesy to the elderly, the society allows to take place privately, among family. And we are pleased to formally announce that your data indicates you have qualified for preservation. Not everyone qualifies, as you know, and it is another honor that you can add to your already long list of achievements. Grandfather takes the device from her and thanks her again. Before she can ask him who he's trusted with the delivery of the sample, he volunteers the information. My son, Abram, will take care of this as well. She nods her head. Simply swab your cheek and put the sample in here, she says, demonstrating. Then seal it up. You need to bring the sample to the Biological Preservation Department within 24 hours of collection, otherwise we cannot guarantee that preservation will be effective. I'm glad that grandfather has qualified to have a tissue sample frozen. Now, for him, death may not necessarily be the end. Someday, the society might figure out a way to bring us back. They don't promise anything, but I think we all know that it will happen eventually. When has the society ever failed in reaching a goal? So why do they take the sample?
Maybe bring them back later.
I say they can maybe bring them back later with that tissue sample. So it's like taking a sample of DNA. The man next to her speaks. The food for your guests and for your own final meal should arrive within the hour. He leans over to hand grandfather a printed menu card. Are there any last-minute modifications you would like to make? Grandfather looks at the card and shakes his head. Everything looks in order. Enjoy your final banquet, then, the man says, pocketing the card. Thank you. There's a wry twist to grandfather's mouth as he says this, as though he knows something they don't. As the committee leaves, they all shake grandfather's hand and say congratulations, and I swear that I can read grandfather's mind as he meets their gaze with his sharp eyes. Are you congratulating me on my life or on my death? Let's get this over with, grandfather says with a spark in his eye, looking at the tissue collection device, and we all laugh at his tone. Grandfather swabs his own cheek, puts the sample in the clear glass tube, and seals it shut. Some of the solemnity leaves the room now that the committee has gone. Everything's going very well, grandfather says, handing the tube to my father. I'm having a perfect death so far. My father winces, an expression of pain crossing his face. I know he, like me, would prefer that Grandfather not use that word, but neither one of us would think of correcting Grandfather today. The pain on my father's face makes him look younger, almost like a child for a moment. Perhaps he remembers his mother's death, so unusual, so difficult compared to a final banquet like this. After today, he will be no one's child. Isn't that an interesting thought? You don't think of your parents as being someone's child very often, do you? Yeah.
So, like, what happened to the grandma?
So remember they mentioned yesterday that, how did she die?
Oh, yeah,
Cancer.
cancer.
Cancer. Yep. So she died of cancer before they had found a cure for it.
Isn't he still kind of dying of old? I mean, he has family, but he doesn't have a wife.
Mm-hmm. True. So is it really any better? Even though I don't want to, I think of the murdered Markham boy. No celebration, no tissue preparation, no goodbyes. That hardly ever occurs, I remind myself. The odds of that happening are almost 1,000,000 to 1. We have some gifts for you, Bram says to Grandfather. Can we give them to you now? Bram, my father says reproachfully. Perhaps he wants to get the microcard ready for viewing. He has guests on the way. I do want to do that, Grandfather says. I'm looking forward to seeing my life pass before my eyes. And I'm looking forward to the food. What did you choose? Bram asks, eager. The selections for Grandfather and his guests are the same, but it is an actual law that we must eat the food from the trays and he must eat the food on his plate. We are not allowed to share. All desserts, Grandfather says with a grin. Cake, pudding, cookies, and something else. But let me see your gift before we do any of that, Bram. Bram beams. Close your eyes. Grandfather obeys and holds out his hand. Bram places the rock gently into Grandfather's palm. A few particles of earth fall on the blanket covering Grandfather, and my mother reaches to brush them away. But at the last second, she pulls her hand back and smiles. Grandfather won't mind the dirt. A rock, Grandfather says, opening his eyes and looking down. He smiles at Bram. I have a feeling I know where you found it. Bram grins and ducks his head. My grandfather holds on tight to the rock. Who's next, then? He asks, almost merrily. I'd like to give my gift later, during the goodbyes, my father says quietly. That won't leave me much time to enjoy it, Grandfather teases. Suddenly self-conscious about my letter, I don't want him to read it in front of everyone. I say, me too. There's a knock at the door, some of Grandfather's friends. A few minutes later, we let them in. After we let them in, more arrive, and more. And then the nutrition personnel with all of Grandfather's desserts, his last meal, and the separate trays for his guests. Grandfather lifts the cover from his plate, and a heavenly warm fruit smell fills the room. I thought you might like some pie, Grandfather says, looking at me. He saw me, then, the other day, and I smile at him. At his signal, I lift the covers from the guest trays, and we all gather around to eat. I serve everyone else first, and then I pick up my piece of pie, flaky and warm and fruit-filled, and lift a forkful of the pastry into my mouth. I wonder if death will always taste this good. After all the guests have put down their forks and sighed in satiation, they talk with Grandfather, who leans back on a pile of thick white pillows. Bram eats on, stuffing himself with bites of everything. Grandfather smiles at him from across the room, amused. It's so good, Bram says around a mouthful of pie, and Grandfather laughs outright. A sound so warm and familiar that I smile too and put my hand down. I was about to touch Bram's arm to tell him to quit feasting, but if Grandfather doesn't mind, why should I?